Picture yourself being led into a courtroom, not because of a crime you committed, but due to the manner in which you loved and lived your life. That was the case for Kody Brown. Man America thought they knew from Sister Wives, when his family's most intimate beliefs were thrust into court for the entire globe to witness. That single question wasn't merely a melodramatic thought for Kody Brown. It became a reality. For years, he had revealed his life to the world on TLC's popular show Sister Wives, exposing the doors to a way of life most were afraid to talk about in the open. Millions watched, wondering, intrigued, or perhaps appalled at how one man juggled life with 4 wives and 18 children. But off camera, off stage from the family meals and questioning, a tempest was brewing quietly, and that storm was going to sweep the Browns into a courtroom, where their faith, their family, and their future would all be on trial. When the cameras first started rolling on Sister Wives back in 2010, the Browns appeared confident, near brutal. They laughed, they argued, and they welcomed America to come watch what life was like when family meant something bigger and different from the conventional image. Kody, with his inimitable blonde hair and ferocious passion, presented his wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, as not simply women he cherished, but as collaborators in an epic, faith-filled odyssey. To the audience, it was gold-dusted reality TV. To detractors, it was proof of a crime. And that's where things got complicated. Because in a large percentage of the United States, polygamy wasn't merely contentious. Polygamy was unlawful. Utah, the state the Browns called home, had a few of the most restrictive anti-plural marriage laws. Though Kody was merely legally wed to one woman, first Mary, and later Robin, his spiritual marriages to the remainder created headlines. The series provided viewers with an intimate glimpse into their unconventional household, but it provided law enforcers with something as well: evidence. Evidence of Kody Brown openly leading a plural life, openly in blatant contravention of Utah's anti-polygamy legislation. Initially, the Browns dismissed the backlash. They believed that America would view their show as a family portrait, not a criminal confession. As more and more episodes were broadcast, however, the backlash grew more shrill. Religious leaders, lawyers, and politicians chimed in. Some praised the Browns for their openness. Others denounced them for popularizing a practice long linked with secrecy, abuse, and exploitation. It was not long before the rumors of legal trouble escalated into much more. The Browns discovered that the police were taking notice. Anonymous complaints, public grievances, and the very public nature of their show moved their family into the national headlines of Utah attorneys general. Their story was no longer one of love and religious devotion. It was about order and law. Put yourself in their place. One day, you're shooting a reality series about your unorthodox lifestyle. The next, you're sitting at a kitchen table, looking over letters and reports that imply criminal charges against you are possible. For the Browns, the reality series they thought would provide insight and tolerance had also presented danger. Danger that threatened to destroy their family. The tension within the home became more burdensome. Both wives bore the burden differently. The first wife, Mary, would be tough on television, but the terror behind closed doors was very real. She feared not only herself but her daughter, how they would be treated by the community when her family were called criminals. Janelle, the pragmatic one, immersed herself in research, studying laws late into the night, attempting to realize the precise threat. Christine, who was more emotional, wondered if inviting everyone into their lives had been a mistake. And the newest wife, Robin, was torn. She had married into the family thinking she was full of love and faith, but now she was observing them walk into a courtroom fight she never saw coming. And Kody, he struggled with being the bold leader and the desperate guardian. He longed to stand up for his family's decisions, but he also couldn't deny the harsh reality. The state of Utah had the ability to prosecute him. The loss of his freedom, and the threat of his wives and children being separated from him, was almost too much to bear. The Browns took a brave step. Rather than hide, rather than retreat, they would resist. They packed up their life in Utah and relocated to Nevada, seeking refuge. But fleeing wasn't sufficient. They had to fight the system itself. With cameras still rolling, they planned to carry their struggle from the couch to the courtroom. The case was no longer simply about the one family. It was something more fundamental. Was it possible for the government to punish consenting adults for their decision to live in a plural lifestyle? Was polygamy merely a crime in black and white? Or could it be justified under the right of privacy, freedom of choice, and religious freedom? These were not merely legal questions. These were moral, cultural, and deeply personal. And so, the astonishing start of the Browns' courtroom odyssey commenced, not in handcuffs or jail time, but in a lawsuit. Kody Brown and his wives chose to take a stand, filing suit against the polygamy laws of Utah. An unprecedented action. A reality television family venturing into federal court to challenge a law that had existed for more than a century. The ruling shocked the press. Reporters covered it like a brushfire. Some portrayed the Browns as heroes, fighting for liberty, others cast them as opportunists, using fame to reshape laws. And as the news spread, so did the risks. If the Browns prevailed, they might redefine how America perceived and policed polygamy. If they failed, they faced not only embarrassment but actual legal repercussions. For the Browns, each newspaper headline was yet another reminder that the stakes were higher than ever. Their faces weren't merely featured on TLC, they were featured on newspapers, websites, and TV screens nationwide. Their battle was no longer a private one. The courtroom was now their forum, and the spectators were the nation. And as the Browns stepped into that courtroom for the first time, clad not in reality show finery, but in the gravitas of defendants and plaintiffs, they bore with them the weight of a question America had never really answered. Was love a crime? This was not about ratings anymore. It was not about family dinners anymore, wives' jealousy, or household drama. This was survival, and it had only just begun. The courthouse was chill, the walls were tall and uninviting, but for the Brown family, entering it was like entering the lion's den. They were not here to respond for thievery, swindling, or brutality. No, they were here because of love. Because Kody Brown, the man America had grown to understand through sister wives, had decided to live openly with 4 wives. But in Utah, that decision wasn't merely contentious. It was a crime. Kody had always maintained that he was legally wed to only one wife, initially Mary and subsequently Robin, and that his other marriages were merely spiritual. But prosecutors viewed it differently. To them, Kody wasn't merely a husband, he was a lawbreaker. And now, for the very first time, the family that had constructed their life on faith and trust found themselves face to face with the hard point of the law. As the Browns took their initial steps into the courtroom, the air was charged with tension. The judge lifted the gavel, and the silence rang out more loudly than any utterance. The courtroom was packed. Journalists in the back pew, attorneys in crisp suits, and onlookers eager to find out how this strange case would go. The state attorneys didn't delay. They had the family's own reality television show as evidence. Flashing before the court were snippets of sister wives with Kody walking hand in hand with Mary, laughing with Janelle, comforting Christine and fawning over Robin. What millions watched as family moments, prosecutors described as evidence of bigamy. Your Honor, one lawyer asserted, this is not an act, this is a confession. Mr. Brown is out and out admitting to practicing polygamy, and Utah law makes it plain such conduct is criminal. Whispers circulated around the room. Was it actually true that the same thing that had made the Browns famous, their candor and honesty, might also be what did them in? While Kody sat at the front table beside his lawyer, his wives sat just a few feet away. Mary's eyes stayed sharp, as if daring the state to challenge the sincerity of her family. Janelle, practical as always, had a notebook in hand, jotting down details as though preparing for a business meeting. Christine fidgeted, her emotions written all over her face, fear, frustration, and a hint of defiance. Robin sat beside her, softly reassuring, but with her own nerves evident in her shaking hands. They weren't criminals. They weren't abusers. They weren't attempting to pretend something they weren't. They were a family, a messy, complicated, loving, flawed one like any other. But here they were, being judged not for their actions, but for how they decided to live. The state drew a bleak picture. Prosecutors contended polygamy could never be innocuous. They talked of past abuses, of women in bondage, of children brought up in unhealthy settings. They conceded they had no evidence of such in the Brown home, but asserted the lifestyle itself was risky. To them, Kody was more than a husband. He was a symbol, a precedent that if left unchecked could encourage others to emulate. This is greater than one family, the prosecutor cautioned. It's about keeping society safe from practices that erode the law. But Kody's attorney stood and spoke with confidence. His voice boomed through the courtroom with conviction. To your honor, he started, this family is not being tried for neglect, fraud, or abuse. They are being tried for love, for accepting a way of life that, though unorthodox, hurts nobody. The Constitution allows us the freedom of religion, the right to privacy, and the right to live free of government interference in our personal options. This case is not about defending society, it's about penalizing difference. The attorney reminded the court that Kody was lawfully wed to one woman alone. The rest were spiritual unions, faith and family symbols but not laws. How could the state criminalize a belief? How could it punish consenting adults who raised their children in a loving home, paid their taxes and complied with every other statute? Are we actually going to treat this family like criminals? He raged, because they had the nerve to be truthful about their lives. Once Christine herself stood up. Her voice trembled at first, but as she went on, the force behind her words became unshakable. We're not hiding, she said quietly, and we're not hurting anybody. We're just a family. We love our children. We love one another. That's all this is. We're not asking anyone else to live the way we are. We're just asking to be permitted to live as we are. Her words quieted the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward, looking at her as if balancing not only the facts but the humanity of the family before him. Behind the fearless faces, however, was fear heavy as a physical weight. The Browns understood that the consequences were tangible. Convictions meant fines, jail time, and even the breaking apart of the family by force. For a man who had 4 wives and 18 children, the prospect was unthinkable. The wives were afraid of losing their children, being labeled criminals, and having the shame stamped upon them by society. Kody was afraid of being removed, his family torn asunder by a law he did not think was fair. But the worst fear of all was this: what if the court did not view them as individuals, but only as a representation of something it had already determined was wrong? Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and headlines filled the internet. Polygamy on trial. Reality TV family and legal battle. Kody Brown defends his lifestyle in court. Supporters rallied online, insisting the Browns were being unfairly targeted. Critics countered, claiming polygamy could never be safe. The nation was divided, and the Browns stood in the middle of it all. They had not merely opened their doors to TLC, they had opened them to America. And now they were opening them to the legal system. A system that could affirm or dismantle all they had created. As the hearings went on, one thing was certain: this was no typical case. This was not a matter of numbers on a marriage certificate, or names on a tax return. This was about freedom, identity, and the power of the law to inform how people live their most intimate lives. For the Browns, every day in court was a roll of the dice. Would the judge view them as criminals, or as a family who fought for their right to be? The trial was just starting, yet it was already redefining the narrative of Kody Brown. No longer a celebrity from a reality show, he was now a man standing in front of the law, representing not only himself, but an entire lifestyle. And as the gavel fell, announcing another day's close, the Browns left the courtroom together, heads high, hearts heavy, and a question ringing louder than ever: can love conquer when the law declares it a crime? The courtroom was a battlefield, not of weapons or fists, but of emotions, words and laws. Both sides had their plan. Every word had meaning, and every testimony was like a part of the Browns' lives being subjected to a microscope. The case wasn't simply about one man and 4 women. It was about what family, freedom, and government power meant. And for Kody Brown and his wives, the stakes were as high as they could be. The state of Utah began its case with force. The chief prosecutor, tart in tone and careful in his language, fingered Kody Brown. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice assertive, "this man thinks he's above the law. He's broadcast his lifestyle to millions of people, challenging this court to overlook what the law expressly forbids. Polygamy has been illegal in this state for some time now for a reason. It is detrimental, it is risky, and it is illegal." The prosecutor continued to paint polygamy not as an innocent individual preference, but as a tradition infused with exploitation and abuse. He cited tales from other communities: women coerced into marriage, children born in hiding, people deprived of liberty. Although none of these charges directly involved the Browns, the prosecutor portrayed their family as a menacing model. If we do nothing to punish this family, he threatened, we open the door to others who are perhaps not so innocent. This is not merely about the Browns, it's about keeping society safe. The testimony the state offered was unconventional. Rather than police reports or documents, they utilized the Browns' own television show. Footage from sister wives was shown in the courtroom. Kody laughing during dinner, Mary discussing her spiritual marriage, Christine discussing the sister-wife dynamics, Robin adjusting to the family. What millions of TV watchers had viewed as a show, the state now labeled evidence of a crime. Here is the defendant, the prosecutor indicated, gesturing toward the screen, brashly confessing to possessing multiple wives. Here are the women themselves testifying about their weddings. This is not conjecture, this is confession. The Browns remained silent, observing their intimate moments made public as evidence. Something that had once made them accessible to the fans was now being spun into the basis for a case against them. But the Browns' attorney was not going to allow the state's version hold without challenge. He stood up from his chair, his dominating presence, and started to rip the prosecution's claims apart, bit by bit. Your Honor, he asserted, what you are watching in those clips is not a crime. Mr. Brown is lawfully married to one woman. The others are spiritual relationships, personal vows that have no legal status. The state is trying to criminalize not actions but beliefs. He reminded the court of the Constitution, of the right to privacy, freedom of religion, and the policy that the government has no business regulating the consensual behavior of adults. The Browns are not criminals, he asserted. They are parents, raising children in a home of love. They are people of faith, living what they believe. If the state can punish them for that, what prevents them from punishing anyone who lives differently? The defense shifted the limelight back to the state. Where was the harm? Where was the evidence of abuse, fraud, and neglect? There wasn't any. All the state had was a TV show, entertainment transformed into accusation. As the case arguments progressed, the court heard the Browns themselves. Each of the wives presented her own view, her own strength, and her own suffering. Mary spoke first, her voice steady but edged with frustration. We chose this life. No one forced us. We're not victims. We're not oppressed. We're a family that believes in supporting each other, even if it looks different from what other people choose. Janelle, always the pragmatist, dwelled on the rationality. We all work. We pay taxes. We follow the laws. We help society. How is our family less legitimate than any other family just because of some figures on paper? Christine's words came with emotion, her voice breaking as she looked toward the judge. When people call us criminals, it hurts our children. They're innocent. They didn't ask to be part of a legal battle. They just want their parents together. Please don't take that from them. Robin, the youngest wife, confessed their own terrors. I became a member of this family because I trusted in love and faith. I never thought that we would be hauled into a courtroom over it. We're not trying to transform the planet. We're simply trying to be left alone to have our lives. Their depositions brought the courtroom to life with something no law text could contain: humanity. The judge sat in silence, his face inscrutable. On the one hand, there was no law to question polygamy was illegal. On the other, the Browns weren't the monsters the state attempted to present them as. They weren't evading. They weren't operating underground rings. They weren't putting anyone's safety at risk. What the judge observed instead was a family tangled perhaps, but unmistakably real. And now he had a choice to make: uphold the law on its face, or weigh the broader ideals of liberty and justice. For Kody, every day in court was a strength test. He wanted to look strong for his wives, confident for his kids, but in his heart he was breaking down. The possibility of being torn away from his family, of his wives being shamed, of his children growing up branded as criminals' kids, tormented him. For the wives, the feelings were just as intense. They were accustomed to jealousy, competition, and hardships of sharing a husband. But this was something different. This wasn't about soap opera drama. This was about survival. They clung to one another, speaking words of encouragement, holding hands when the fear overwhelmed them. Even the kids were under the stress, too young to be present in the courtroom, but they sensed something was amiss. They heard what they could at school in passing: read the headlines on their devices. They questioned their mothers with questions no child should ever have to ask. Are we going to lose Dad? Are they going to take us away? The courtroom became the crossroads of two worlds, the sterile precision of law and the raw emotion of family. Every argument, every witness pulled the case in a different direction. To the state, this was protecting society. To the Browns, protecting their right to be. And to the judge, a balance between the law on the page and justice as it needs to be. As the trial progressed, tension outside the courtroom also increased. The faithful gathered, bearing signs that said freedom of choice and love is not a crime. Opponents had signs that stated protect women and children and polygamy destroys families. The Browns were no longer simply defendants. They were symbols. They were freedom pioneers to some. They were evidence of all that was bad about polygamy to others. And as the gavel fell to close another day, the Browns emerged out into a sea of cameras, microphones, and flashes of light. The world watched, judged, and waited. But within the courtroom, the deliberations were hardly finished. The state was as bent on making an example of the Browns as the defense was on saving them. And the judge was aware that whatever he ruled would resonate far beyond the confines of his courtroom. For the Browns, each sentence uttered within that room wasn't mere legalese. It was their future, their liberty, their family. And as the emotions overflowed, one thing was brutally evident: this was not just a trial of law. It was a trial of hearts, faith, and the very nature of love. Court cases are wars of patience. Weeks become months. Arguments are circular, and both sides struggle to influence the judge. For the Brown family, it was never-ending, each hearing another indication that their existence was at stake. But at some point, all wars get to their breaking point. And for Kody Brown and his wives, that breaking point was in 2013, when a federal judge made a ruling that would rock not only their family, but the entire state of Utah. Prior to the verdict, the Browns sat as a family in the courtroom, jitters coursing through each hushed breath. They had testified, witnessed their personal lives torn apart on television screens, and endured the prosecution's incessant arguments. Now, there was nothing more to say. The jury rested in the judge's hands alone. Kody leaned forward, elbows on the table, his normally effervescent personality subdued. For once, the man who was always so confident and charismatic said nothing, his mind reeling with possibilities. His wives sat beside him, their hands locked together. Any outcome they envisioned had a cost. A guilty verdict might mean prosecution, separation, and the shame of being declared criminals. But an acquittal, just perhaps, could allow them the liberty to live without fear. The courtroom was heavy with silence, a storm that was about to burst. Back rows were filled by reporters with their pens at the ready and cameras snapping into position. Outside, supporters and critics had congested the sidewalk, chanting, holding signs, and waiting for word. The Browns were no longer just a family, but as symbols in a national controversy. As the judge finally appeared, the ring of the gavel sliced through the air like a knife. The courtroom grew silent. He pushed his glasses up, shuffled his papers, and started to read. The words crept along slowly, deliberately, each sentence bearing the weight of decades of legal tradition. It sounded ordinary at first. Mentions of laws, precedents, constitutional rights. But then, the voice changed. The judge recognized the state's interest in preventing polygamy, its history of abuse in certain communities, and its long-standing ban. But he also recognized something essential. The Browns themselves had not been guilty of abuse, fraud, or coercion. They were adults who consented to their relationships, raising children, paying taxes, and living openly. Then came the phrase that turned everything on its head. The provision of Utah law that criminalizes cohabitation among consenting adults is unconstitutional. The words hung there, seemingly unbelievable. For decades, Utah's anti-polygamy law had cast a shadow over families like the Browns. Now, a federal judge had struck it down, at least partially. Christine's hands flew to her face as tears welled in her eyes. Janelle exhaled, her shoulders finally releasing the tension she had carried for months. Robin clutched Mary's hand, whispering prayers of gratitude. And Kody, very outspoken Kody, sat stunned, his lips parting in a mix of disbelief and relief. They hadn't just avoided prosecution. They had won. The courtroom was filled with whispers, gasps, and scratching of pens as journalists competed to get the momentous shot. Supporters grinned and hugged, while opponents shook their heads and began concocting their counter-arguments. But to the Browns, all that did not matter in that instant. It mattered only that they were safe. For the first time in years, they could breathe free from worry that the law would open their door. However, the win wasn't complete. The judge hadn't legalized polygamy, in the form of several marriage licenses. The Browns wouldn't be able to go into a courthouse and have 4 marriages registered. What he did do, though, was substantial. He struck down the section of law that criminalized adults living together in a plural relationship. In simple words, this meant that the Browns, and those like them, could no longer be charged with crimes for merely being a family. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was an important step in the right direction. It was sufficient for the Browns. They weren't seeking government approval of their unions. They weren't seeking recognition. They simply wanted to be able to live without handcuffs, fines, or prison. And now, at least temporarily, they had that. Naturally, not everyone was rejoicing. Critics spoke out immediately in outrage, warning the ruling would open the door to abusive practices. They maintained that polygamy could never be decoupled from abuse, that even if the Browns seemed harmless, others might use the ruling to justify abusive communities. Politicians in Utah threatened appeals, promising to fight the law. Advocacy groups battled in the media, some labeling the decision a victory for liberty, others labeling it a step backward for justice. And in the midst of it all, the Browns were back in the news. They were called pioneers, rebels, or opportunists, depending on the spin. Social media went wild with arguments. They were heroes to some, villains to others. Behind closed doors, out of sight of cameras and microphones, the Browns attempted to make sense of what had occurred. Mary, ever contemplative, acknowledged that she was both delighted and afraid. "We won today," she whispered, "but the world is still going to look at us differently. That's not something that's going to change overnight." Janelle, as always practical, brought up the fact, "This decision safeguards us legally, but it doesn't address our issues at home. We still have to work out how to coexist, how to bring up our children, how to juggle all of this." Christine was more sentimental, and she felt the win intensely. "For years I felt as though we were hiding in the shadows, waiting for the knock on the door. Today, I feel like we came out into the light." And Robin, who is newer to the family, was thankful. "I didn't have any idea what I was stepping into when I married Kody. I never thought I'd be going to court and struggling. But I'm proud of us. We held our ground." And Kody vindicated. For him, the decision was a validation that they had been correct all along, that their lifestyle, as weird as it might be, was not criminal. He understood there were still challenges, social stigma, familial strife, personal issues, but at least for the moment, the law was not a tool wielded against them. Aside from the Browns, the case was a landmark moment in the legal history of polygamy in America. For the first time in decades, a court had undone a law that criminalized plural families. It did not make polygamy legal, but it did mean the state no longer could show up at someone's door and prosecute them for simply being a family of greater than 2 adults. It was a quiet but potent distinction, a step toward understanding that love and family can be many things. And for millions of viewers who had tuned in since the very start of Sister Wives, it was the most dramatic turn of events yet. The family who once dared everything by going public had now rewritten the very laws that imperiled them. But even in triumph, shadows remained. The court decision couldn't erase the shame. It couldn't dampen the critics. And it couldn't heal the deeper pain within the Brown family, pain that over time would engender cracks too deep to repair. The courtroom had granted them liberty in law, but liberty was costly. Additional attention, additional judgment, additional pressure to validate themselves to a world that would never completely embrace them. Nevertheless, the Browns were aware that they had acted on a different line in history. They had confronted the system and came out victorious. The tempest that had sought to end them had in turn transformed into the tipping point that would determine their legacy. As the Browns exited the courthouse that morning, flanked by cameras and microphones, they stood tall. Their smiles weren't fake for once, forced for television cameras. They were genuine, infused with relief and victory. They'd entered court as defendants, charged with being criminals for their lifestyle. They exited as winners, with not only a ruling but also a message: love is not a crime. And although the journey that lay before them was by no means smooth, the Browns understood that this day would never be forgotten, as the day their saga, and the saga of polygamy in the United States, turned dramatically. Courtroom wins are cheered in the headlines, but ordinary life doesn't usually end so tidily. For the Browns, the judge's ruling felt like a hard-won victory, but as the dust settled, they quickly learned that freedom was not without new challenges: personal, social, and even legal. Their saga didn't end in the courtroom. In some respects, it was only starting. Following the court decision, the Browns found themselves icons of a culture war they never wished to espouse. Their faces were seen on national television shows, media coverage, and prolonged debates online. Some praised them as courageous pioneers who had defied an archaic law. Others condemned them for undermining societal values and disrupting the pillars of marriage. For Kody and his wives, each visit to the store or public function was accompanied by stares, whispers, or even blunt questions. Fans would greet them with thanks, saying, "You changed my perception of love." Critics were not so gracious. Some hissed insults behind their backs. Others yelled accusations. The Browns were no longer a family but a lightning rod for controversy. Behind the lenses and legal news, the family had its own set of problems. Existing as one big household had always been a problem, but the pressure of court fights, public opinion, and being in the news all the time increased every little fight. Mary, the original wife, started to feel more and more isolated. Her union with Kody, strong in the beginning, began to crack. She felt that she was living outside of her role in the family and questioned if her sacrifices were worth it. Janelle, calm and down to earth, attempted to maintain a balance, but even she felt the pressure of the limelight. Intimacy was all but impossible, and financial strains of caring for such a huge family became more burdensome with each passing year. Christine, one of the most vocal emotional supporters of the lifestyle, was starting to struggle with her own doubts. Her need for independence conflicted with the harsh reality of sharing a husband, and that only grew stronger with the passage of time. And Robin, the youngest of the wives, had special challenges. As the newest member of the family, she found herself sometimes feeling like an insider and sometimes an outsider. Her children were being raised in a world where cameras shadowed every move they made, and she feared the impact that exposure could have on them. Even Kody, the man who had united them all, found it difficult to maintain the family's cohesion. Having 4 wives and 18 children to care for in personal relationships was never simple, but the additional pressure of fame and public scrutiny made it almost impossible. While the Browns rejoiced over their partial legal triumph, Utah's government was swift in appealing. Authorities argued that the decision undermined the state's authority to police polygamy, threatening that it would encourage harmful groups in which abuse and exploitation at times transpired. The appeals court overturned part of the decision in 2016, in effect bringing back some of Utah's anti-polygamy law. For the Browns, it was a step in the wrong direction. They weren't being charged, but the uncertainty was back. Would they be prosecuted under the law again someday? The legal tug-of-war reminded them that their triumph wasn't so secure. It was tentative, vulnerable to appeals courts and changing interpretations. Freedom, they learned, was never guaranteed. It was something they'd need to continue defending. Even with the setbacks in court, the Browns' case left a lasting impression on American society. Prior to sister wives, polygamy was something most people thought about when they heard about secretive rural enclaves. It was frequently depicted as abusive, coercive, or cult-like. But the Browns had represented a different portrait. They lived in suburban houses. Their children attended public schools. They paid taxes, observed holidays, and argued over chores like any other family. To millions of viewers, they made plural marriage human and understandable in a way that no book or scholarly argument could. Even those who had disagreed with the lifestyle conceded that the Browns had initiated a discussion: do consenting adults have the right to create families in the manner they choose? If freedom of religion and association is important, does it not imply the freedom to love more than one spouse? The Browns did not resolve the argument, but they ensured it could no longer be avoided. As the years went by, the outside fights gave way to inside ones. The pressure of keeping together such a big family with the media watching started to tear them apart. Mary's marriage with Kody suffered the most. A well-publicized catfishing scandal revealed her loneliness and vulnerability, and her relationship with Kody never fully recovered. Christine too grew frustrated with the imbalance in their relationships. In time, she made the heartbreaking decision to leave the marriage altogether. What had been a seeming united front now started to fall apart. The same family that had stood against the law now fought to keep itself intact. And yet, even amidst the separations and the fighting, the Browns continued to be forthright in sharing their story. They didn't keep their wounds covered up. They didn't masquerade as perfect. Rather, they showed the world the difficulties of plural marriage, the jealousy, the insecurity, the sacrifices, and the love and commitment that had held them together so long. So what is the real legacy of Kody Brown and his family? Legally, their case undermined Utah's draconian anti-polygamy statutes, although briefly. Socially, they altered the perception millions of Americans had of plural marriage. They pulled it out of the dark into American living rooms and made people confront uncomfortable questions about love, liberty, and family. But most of all, perhaps, their greatest legacy is more intimate. In their struggles and successes, they portrayed the gritty reality of going down an alternative route. They portrayed that different families are not something theoretical, but actual individuals, with humor, tears, and complex relationships. They didn't necessarily win. They didn't always remain united. But they lived their truth on the world stage, and in doing so they penned a tale that will be told for years to come, long after the cameras fade out. As the sun sets on their courtroom wars and their family saga continues to play out, the Brown saga is far from over. Laws will keep changing, society will keep arguing, and their family will keep changing. But one thing is for sure: Kody Brown and his wives left an indelible mark on history. They showed us that even regular folks equipped with bravery, determination, and love can push back against the system, draw out the debate, and remake the world, court case by court case. And for everyone who watched with envy or disdain, their story is a strong reminder. Family is not made by law. Family is made by love.